They destroyed my life's work with chainsaws and bulldozers, so I turned their lakefront paradise into a mosquito-infested swampland. 6 a.m., diesel engines roaring. HOA President Delilah Thornwick in her pristine white blazer, directing 12 workers to demolish my hand-carved memorial bridge. No permits, no warning, just pure, calculated destruction. The bright yellow bulldozer's steel blade catches my cedar railings. 6 months of grief therapy after my wife Sarah died, every duck motif carved with love, and shoves them into Willowbrook Lake with a bone-deep crack splash. Chainsaws shriek through posts I'd sanded smooth with my own hands. Delilah stands there like a general, not one blonde hair out of place, watching my heart break in real time. She called it visual pollution. But here's what that entitled princess didn't know. I'd been secretly studying federal wetland law for 3 months, and I had her 1987 property surveys showing something very, very illegal. Her $2.8 million glass mansion, built on protected wetlands. Wait till you see what happened next. My name's Ezra Blackwood, 58, retired Navy civil engineer, widower. 6 months ago, my wife Sarah died of cancer, and I moved to Willowbrook Lake Estates to rebuild my life one cedar plank at a time. Sarah collected wooden ducks, hundreds of them. After she died, I couldn't look at them, couldn't throw them away, so I did what engineers do. I built something. A memorial footbridge connecting my modest dock to the small island where I'd scattered her ashes. 6 months of dawn to dusk work, hand-carved railings with duck motifs, cedar planks sanded smoother than silk, every joint fitted like jewelry. The rhythmic rasp of sandpaper became my meditation. The honest scent of fresh-cut wood became my salvation. My neighbors seemed decent at first. Retired couples, young families with kids who'd wave from their kayaks. Properties ranged from cabins like mine to massive lakefront mansions with manicured lawns rolling down to private beaches. Then I met the neighborhood queen. Delilah Thornwick burst into my life on a Tuesday morning like a designer tornado. 52 years old, platinum blonde hair that defied physics, driving a white Tesla with Blessed One vanity plates. She lived in the biggest mansion on the lake. $2.8 million worth of floor-to-ceiling glass that screamed, "Look at me." Picture everything wrong with inherited wealth wrapped in a Chanel suit. I was hand-rubbing linseed oil into my bridge railings when her heels click-clacked across my gravel driveway. Designer sunglasses, clipboard, smile sharp enough to gut fish. "Good morning. I'm Delilah Thornwick, HOA president." Her voice dripped fake honey. "What a rustic little project." The way she said rustic made it sound like a disease. "It's a memorial bridge for my wife," I said, not looking up. "Oh." Her mask slipped for 2 seconds, almost human, then snapped back. "I'm sure she would have loved it. But we need to discuss some concerns. Here we go. We maintain aesthetic harmony standards here at Willowbrook Lake Estates. Several neighbors have expressed concerns about your addition's visual impact." I stood slowly, wiping oil from my hands. "What concerns?" "The bridge creates a prominent visual element that disrupts our natural lakefront vista. We've worked hard maintaining property values, and anything too DIY can affect the entire community." Her jasmine perfume was so overpowering it made honest cedar smell apologetic. "Who complained?" "Anonymous concerns, you understand. Perhaps if you removed it voluntarily, we could avoid any unpleasantness." That's when I realized I was dealing with a bully who'd never been punched back. "Ma'am, I checked the HOA covenants before building. Nothing prohibits dock improvements or decorative structures." Her smile tightened like a stretched rubber band. "Mr. Blackwood, rules evolve, community standards change. What matters is neighborhood consensus." "Whose consensus?" "You haven't talked to everyone." "I don't need to. As HOA president, I represent community interests." She pulled out a formal notice. "This gives you 48 hours to remove the structure voluntarily. After that, we'll pursue other options." I took the paper, scanning the legal language, standard intimidation tactics wrapped in official letterhead, but something felt off. The violation codes didn't match anything in my covenant documents. "This bridge honors my dead wife," I said quietly. "It's not coming down." Delilah's mask finally fell completely. Her eyes went cold as January lake ice. Mr. Blackwood, you clearly don't understand how things work here. This is a prestigious community with standards. We can't have every newcomer building whatever folk art project strikes their fancy, folk art project. Like Sarah's memory was some weekend hobby. I understand perfectly, I replied. You're a bully in designer clothes who thinks money gives you the right to crush people. She stepped back like I'd slapped her. I'll be in touch, Mr. Blackwood. Very soon. As her Tesla purred away, I stood there holding that bogus violation notice, breathing in the scent of cedar and rage. The sound of her engine faded, replaced by gentle lapping of lake water against my dock. That's when I made my decision. She wanted a fight? She was about to get one from someone who'd spent 30 years learning how systems work, and how to break them. 48 hours came and went like a bad storm. My bridge stayed exactly where it was, gleaming with fresh linseed oil and righteous defiance. Wednesday morning, 7 a.m. sharp, Delilah's Tesla crunched into my driveway again. This time she brought reinforcements, a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit clutching a briefcase like it contained nuclear launch codes. Mr. Blackwood, she called out, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for scolding disobedient children. I see you've chosen to ignore our reasonable request. I was sitting on my dock with coffee and the morning paper, intentionally calm. I chose to ignore your illegal demand. Yes, ma'am. Her companion cleared his throat. I'm Gerald Voss from the County Building Department. Mrs. Thornwick has filed several safety violations regarding your unpermitted structure. Now this was interesting. Safety violations? Gerald fumbled with his paperwork. Structural integrity concerns, potential navigation hazard for watercraft, environmental impact on fish spawning areas. I nearly choked on my coffee. Fish spawning? It's a footbridge, not a dam. But here's the twist that made my engineering brain light up like Christmas morning. Every single violation Gerald listed required specific measurements and professional assessments, which meant Delilah had paid for an official inspection of my property without my knowledge or consent. That's called trespassing where I come from. Gerald, I said, standing up slowly, when exactly did you inspect my bridge? His face went 3 shades of red. Well, Mrs. Thornwick provided detailed photographs and measurements. So you filed official violations based on photographs? Without setting foot on my property or conducting actual measurements? The silence stretched longer than a Sunday sermon. Time for my counterpunch. I walked to my truck and pulled out a thick manila folder I'd prepared for exactly this moment. See, my first week here, I'd done what any good engineer does. I researched everything, spent 2 days at the county clerk's office, breathing that musty smell of old documents, digging through every filing cabinet until I found the original 1987 Willowbrook Lake HOA covenant documents. Gerald, meet the real rules, I said, opening the folder. Section 4.2 specifically allows riparian access structures including but not limited to docks, piers, and connecting walkways. Gerald's face went from red to green. We weren't provided with those documents. Funny thing about that, I flipped to another page. These covenants also establish that any HOA rule changes require a 2/3 majority vote of all homeowners with 30 days advance notice. When exactly was that vote held, Mrs. Thornwick? Delilah's perfect composure cracked like thin ice. The board has executive authority to interpret community standards. The board has authority granted by these covenants, which you apparently haven't read. I handed Gerald a copy. Here's something interesting I learned during my Navy days dealing with base housing regulations. Grandfathered improvements that predate current interpretations are legally protected. You can't retroactively change rules to target specific owners. Gerald was speed reading like his job depended on it, which it probably did. Mrs. Thornwick, he said carefully, these documents do appear to support Mr. Blackwood's position. I'll need to reassess our violation notices. You could practically hear Delilah's teeth grinding. Gerald, I think you're missing the bigger picture here. Community harmony. Ma'am, I deal with building codes, not community harmony. If the structure's legally permitted, I can't cite it as a violation. That's when she played her next card, and I saw the real Delilah emerge from behind the designer mask. Well then, perhaps we need to examine other aspects of Mr. Blackwood's improvements. I've noticed several potential issues that warrant closer inspection. The threat was clear as mountain lake water. She couldn't touch my bridge legally, so she'd manufacture other violations. Classic bureaucratic warfare. If you can't win on substance, drown your opponent in process. But here's what Delilah didn't understand about Navy engineers. We're trained to think 3 moves ahead. Attack my bridge? I research property law. Threaten manufactured violations? I research her authority. Gerald, I said, pulling out another document, while you're reassessing things, you might want to review this complaint I filed with the county ombudsman's office yesterday. Seems someone's been conducting unauthorized property inspections and filing false violation reports. Gerald's briefcase suddenly felt very heavy in his hands. I also filed a formal harassment complaint with the state HOA Regulatory Commission. During my research, I discovered they're very interested in cases involving selective enforcement and abuse of authority. Amazing what you can find online these days. Delilah's mask slipped completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mr. Blackwood. This community has ways of handling troublemakers. Is that a threat, Mrs. Thornwick? Because Gerald here is a county employee, and threatening residents in front of witnesses might constitute official misconduct. The morning air filled with the sound of Gerald's nervous breathing and lake water gently lapping against my dock. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called, probably laughing at the absurdity of it all. Delilah gathered herself like a woman preparing for war. This isn't over. No, ma'am, it's not, I replied, feeling something I hadn't felt since Sarah died stirring in my chest. It's just getting started. As they drove away, Gerald's county truck following Delilah's Tesla like a reluctant dog, I stood there holding my original covenants and tasting victory for the first time in months. Sweet as cedar sap, 3 days of blessed silence. Then Delilah struck back with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. Thursday morning, I found a shiny new padlock on the community boat launch gate. Not just any lock, a heavy-duty master lock that gleamed like a middle finger pointed directly at me. Attached was a crisp white notice, Community Boat Launch, authorized residents only, by order of Pinnacle Property Management. Pinnacle Property Management. Never heard of them. I was studying the lock when my neighbor Mabel Fitzgerald shuffled over, her ancient terrier Winston sniffing around my feet. Mabel was 73, lived in a tidy cottage 2 doors down, and had been feeding the lake's ducks for 15 years. They locked me out too, she said, her voice trembling with outrage. Said my duck feeding was encouraging nuisance wildlife and creating unsanitary conditions. Since when do we have a property management company? Since Tuesday, emergency HOA board meeting. Delilah called it while half the neighborhood was at work. Mabel's weathered hands shook as she held up her own violation notice. $200 daily fines for continued wildlife feeding. Can you believe it? That's when I noticed the pattern. Delilah couldn't attack me directly anymore, so she was carpet bombing the entire community to make my life miserable. Classic scorched earth tactics. But she'd made a critical error. She'd pissed off Mabel, never piss off a retired librarian who knows where all the bodies are buried. Mabel, when exactly was this vote held? Tuesday, 2 p.m. Only 5 people showed up. All Delilah's cronies from the tennis club. I pulled out my phone and started researching Pinnacle Property Management right there on the spot. Amazing what you can find in 30 seconds of Google searches these days. Corporate registration, Better Business Bureau complaints, active lawsuits. Well, I'll be damned, I muttered. What? Pinnacle has contracts with 47 HOAs across 3 states. They've got active class action lawsuits in Florida and Arizona for predatory practices. Same playbook every time. Manufacture violations, pile on fines, justify massive management fees. My mind was already 3 moves ahead. During my Navy days, I'd seen this exact scam targeting military families. Companies would swoop in, create crisis situations, then charge premium fees to solve problems they'd created themselves. Mabel, do you still have contacts at the county courthouse? Her eyes lit up like sparklers. Honey, I worked there for 30 years. I know every filing system in that building. Think you could help me research something? 2 hours later, we were sitting in Mabel's kitchen surrounded by official documents that painted a very interesting picture. Winston the terrier was curled up on a stack of property deeds, snoring peacefully. Look at this, Mabel said, adjusting her reading glasses. Pinnacle's contract with our HOA includes a 15% commission on all fines collected. The more violations they write, the more money they make. That's not the best part. I spread out a map of the lake. Check out which properties have received violation notices. Mabel studied the pattern. All the modest homes, None of the mansions. Exactly. They're targeting people who can't afford to fight back legally. But here's where my engineering background came in handy. I'd learned something important during base housing disputes. When bureaucrats manufacture violations, they always leave paper trails, and paper trails can be followed both ways. Mabel, look at this boat launch padlock situation. According to your original 1987 deed, what kind of access rights do you have? She traced her finger along the legal language. Perpetual easement rights to community boat launch and lake access for all property owners in good standing, which means they can't legally restrict your access. The boat launch sits on a recorded easement that predates any HOA authority. That's when we found the smoking gun. Buried in the Pinnacle contract was a clause requiring them to identify revenue opportunities through enhanced enforcement protocols. Translation: find ways to generate fines or you don't get paid. This is extortion with a corporate logo, Mabel said. It's worse than that. It's a systematic scam targeting vulnerable homeowners. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. But here's what they didn't count on. I put all my HOA fines into an escrow account pending legal resolution. Forces them to prove their violations are legitimate before they can collect a penny. Mabel's eyes went wide. You can do that? Any property owner can. Escrow accounts are specifically designed for disputed charges. Puts the burden of proof back on them. That afternoon, I walked down to the locked boat launch with bolt cutters and my original deed. The lock lasted about 15 seconds against $40 worth of hardened steel. I left the cut lock on Delilah's doorstep with a note. Maritime access rights established 1987. Lock my legal easement again and I'll file federal charges for restricting navigable waterways. The sound of her Tesla starting up 20 minutes later was sweeter than morning coffee. But as I sat on my bridge that evening, watching the sun set over water that sparkled like liquid gold, I knew this was just the opening round. Delilah had brought professionals to the fight. Time for me to do the same. Monday morning brought legal letterhead and the metallic taste of real war. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, with Whitman and Associates Attorneys at Law embossed in gold lettering. Inside, 3 pages of dense legalese that basically boiled down to, remove your bridge, pay us $15,000 in administrative costs, or we'll destroy your life. I was reading it over coffee when my phone rang. Ezra? Jake Morrison here, Commander Jake Morrison, retired JAG lawyer and my old Navy buddy. We'd served together on 3 deployments, and Jake had a talent for finding loopholes in regulations that could drive base commanders to drinking. Jake, perfect timing. I need someone to translate lawyer speak into English. Send it over. I've got an hour before my golf game. 20 minutes later, Jake called back, laughing. Jesus, Ezra, these people are either stupid or desperate. Maybe both. That bad? Worse. First, they're demanding payment for administrative costs that have no legal basis. Second, they're claiming authority they don't possess. Third, and this is the beautiful part, Whitman and Associates has financial ties to Pinnacle Property Management. My coffee suddenly tasted better. Conflict of interest? Textbook case. They can't represent the HOA while having business relationships with the management company. I'm filing a complaint with the State Bar Association this afternoon. But Jake wasn't done. There's something else. I ran Whitman and Associates through my legal database. They specialize in what they call community compliance enforcement. Basically, they're the legal muscle for property management scams. The pieces were clicking into place like a well-oiled rifle bolt. Delilah hadn't just hired random lawyers. She'd brought in specialists who made their living intimidating homeowners into submission. Jake, how many cases like this have they handled? 43 in the last 2 years. Same pattern every time. Manufacture violations, pile on legal threats, force settlements to avoid court costs. That's when I realized something important from my engineering days. Every system has a weakness. And Delilah's system had a fatal flaw. It depended on people being too scared or too broke to fight back. But I wasn't scared, and Sarah's life insurance had left me comfortable enough to wage legal warfare. Jake, what happens if someone actually fights back? That's the thing, nobody ever has. These people prey on elderly folks and young families who can't afford lawyers. They've never faced someone with resources and military training. After hanging up with Jake, I spent the afternoon doing what I should have done weeks ago. comprehensive reconnaissance on enemy positions, property records, business licenses, professional associations, financial filings. By sunset, I had a complete intelligence picture that would have made my old Navy intelligence officer proud. Here's what I discovered. 3 lakefront mansions, including Delilah's, were built 15 to 20 feet inside the original wetland buffer zone established in 1987. The original environmental impact assessment required a 50-foot setback from natural springs and seasonal wetlands, but someone had quietly filled in the wetlands before construction, creating dry land that technically didn't exist when the permits were issued. Environmental violations under the Clean Water Act carry federal penalties up to $37,500 per day. And unlike HOA disputes, environmental law doesn't mess around. I called Jake back. Remember that environmental law seminar you made me attend in Norfolk? The one you complained about for 6 months? Yeah. Citizens can file enforcement complaints when government agencies won't act, right? Long pause. Ezra, what exactly are you thinking? I'm thinking Delilah wants to play hardball with lawyers and property management companies, but she's forgotten that some battles are fought in federal court. Environmental violations trump HOA authority every time, Jake said slowly, but you'd need solid evidence. I've got the original 1987 surveys showing natural wetland boundaries. I've got current photos showing illegal fill and structures built in violation of federal setback requirements. And I've got water quality tests showing chemical contamination from infinity pools and lawn treatments. The silence stretched like a taut fishing line. Holy shit, Ezra. You're talking about potentially seizing illegally built properties. I'm talking about restoring the natural wetlands that were illegally destroyed to build McMansions. The fact that it might flood some basements is just environmental justice. That evening, I sat on my memorial bridge watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah's Island looked peaceful in the fading light, cattails swaying in the evening breeze. Somewhere across the lake, Delilah was probably planning her next legal assault, confident that lawyers and money could crush one stubborn widower. She had no idea I was about to call in the federal government. Environmental Protection Agency Regional Office, here I come. The sound of a great blue heron calling from the shallows seemed almost like applause. 3 a.m. is when secrets reveal themselves to insomniacs and engineers with nothing left to lose. I'd been awake since midnight, poring over environmental surveys by lamplight when I found it. Buried in the appendix of the original 1987 Environmental Impact Assessment, a single paragraph that made my hands shake with something between rage and vindication. Seasonal wetland complex supports critical waterfowl breeding habitat. Natural spring system requires minimum 50-foot buffer zone. Any development within buffer zone subject to Federal Clean Water Act jurisdiction and mandatory mitigation requirements. But here's the kicker. Attached was a detailed map showing the original wetland boundaries. And according to that map, 5 lakefront mansions, including Delilah's Glass Palace, were sitting squarely on top of what used to be protected wetlands. Someone had quietly filled in those wetlands with truck after truck of sand and gravel, then built million-dollar homes on land that legally shouldn't exist. I cross-referenced the wetland map with current property surveys. Delilah's infinity pool, the one that sparkled like liquid diamonds in the evening light, was built directly over a natural spring that once fed the entire lake ecosystem. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I didn't care. This was bigger than HOA harassment. This was environmental destruction on a massive scale, hidden behind lawyers and property management companies. I pulled up the Clean Water Act on my laptop. Environmental violations carry penalties up to $37,500 per day, not per incident, per day. And there's no statute of limitations on ongoing environmental damage. But the real power came from something most people don't know. Citizens can enforce environmental laws when government agencies won't act. The law actually encourages private citizens to file complaints and pursue enforcement action. During my Navy days, I'd seen environmental violations shut down entire military bases. Federal environmental law doesn't negotiate with property values or community standards. It simply restores natural systems, regardless of what's built on top of them. I thought about Sarah, about how she used to love watching the ducks that visited our old Chicago backyard. She'd talk about how important wetlands were for migrating waterfowl, how developers always seemed to find ways around environmental protections. They think money trumps everything, she'd said once, watching a news story about wetland destruction. But nature always finds a way to reclaim what was stolen. Now I understood what she meant. Restoring the natural spring system would flood the illegally filled areas. Delilah's infinity pool would become part of a natural wetland complex again. Her basement wine cellar would host fish instead of vintage Bordeaux. Environmental remediation costs typically run $200,000 to $500,000 per property. Insurance doesn't cover damages from illegal construction or environmental violations. And environmental liens survive property sales. They follow the land forever. The woman who'd destroyed my memorial to Sarah was living in an environmental crime scene worth $2.8 million, and she had no idea federal law was about to make her an accessory to ecological destruction. I picked up my phone and dialed the EPA Regional Office Emergency Hotline. Environmental Protection Agency, this is Agent Sarah Crawford. Agent Crawford, my name is Ezra Blackwood. I'm a retired Navy engineer, and I need to report ongoing Clean Water Act violations affecting a critical wetland system. What's the nature of the violations, sir? Illegal filling of seasonal wetlands, unpermitted construction in federal buffer zones, and ongoing contamination of natural spring systems. I have documentation going back to 1987. Long pause. Sir, how extensive are these violations? I looked out my window toward Delilah's mansion where lights still glowed behind those massive glass walls. Agent Crawford, we're talking about 5 properties worth over $12 million total, all built on illegally filled wetlands, and I can prove it. We'll have an inspector on site within 48 hours. As I hung up the phone, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky pale gold. Across the lake, Delilah's house sat like a glass monument to environmental destruction, completely unaware that federal justice was about to knock on her door. Sarah would have loved this. War requires allies, strategy, and enough righteous fury to sustain a long campaign. By Thursday morning, my kitchen had transformed into a command center that would have made my old Navy intelligence unit proud. Wall-sized property maps covered in colored pins and string connections. Stacks of environmental regulations highlighted in fluorescent yellow. The honest scent of fresh coffee mixing with determination and the faint smell of printer ink from dozens of copied documents. Jake Morrison arrived first, carrying a briefcase and wearing the same predatory smile he'd worn before dismantling incompetent base commanders. Ezra, you magnificent bastard, he said, surveying my war room. You've turned a property dispute into a federal environmental case. Had good teachers. I poured him coffee from a pot that had been brewing since dawn. What's our legal strategy? Jake spread out a thick folder. 3 phases. First, we document every environmental violation with professional-grade evidence. Second, we file a comprehensive EPA complaint with photographic proof and expert testimony. Third, we request an emergency injunction to halt further wetland damage. How long before federal action? EPA moves fast on citizen complaints with solid evidence. They have to. Congress mandates response timelines. Jake's smile turned wolf-like. Plus, election year. Nobody wants to be seen ignoring environmental crimes. The kitchen door creaked open as Mabel Fitzgerald entered with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. Dr. Rodriguez teaches environmental biology at the State University, Mabel explained. She's also a wetlands consultant for EPA enforcement actions. Elena shook my hand with a grip that could crush walnuts. Mabel showed me your preliminary findings. If your documentation is accurate, this represents one of the most flagrant Clean Water Act violations I've seen in 20 years. What makes you so sure? Natural spring systems like this one are considered waters of the United States under federal jurisdiction. Filling them without permits isn't just illegal, it's ecological vandalism. She pulled out a tablet loaded with scientific surveys. I've been monitoring lake water quality for 3 years. Chemical contamination levels have increased 340% since 2020. Source? Infinity pool chlorine, lawn fertilizer runoff, and septic systems too close to natural springs, all traceable to the same 5 properties. That's when Tommy Dakota knocked on my door. Local newspaper editor, investigative reporter, and according to Mabel, someone with a grudge against HOA corruption. Mr. Blackwood? Mabel said you might have a story worth telling. Depends. You interested in environmental crimes or just property disputes? Tommy's eyes lit up. Environmental crimes involving wealthy developers who think rules don't apply to them. That's Pulitzer material. Within 2 hours, my kitchen was buzzing with coordinated activity. Jake drafted legal complaints while Elena collected water samples in labeled bottles. Tommy documented everything with professional photography equipment, creating an evidence timeline that could survive federal court scrutiny. But the real breakthrough came when Mabel returned from her own reconnaissance mission. "I spent the morning in the courthouse basement," she announced, carrying a box of dusty files. "Found the original construction permits for all 5 mansions. And every single permit application lists the construction area as previously disturbed land with no wetlands present." She pulled out aerial photographs from 1985. But these photos clearly show seasonal wetlands and natural springs. Elena studied the photos through a magnifying glass. "This is documentary fraud. Someone falsified environmental surveys to obtain illegal building permits." "Gets better," Mabel continued. "I traced the environmental consultant who signed off on all 5 projects. Same company, same fraudulent assessments, all within a 2-year period." Jake looked up from his legal briefs. "RICO territory, systematic fraud involving multiple properties and government permits." "What's RICO?" I asked. "Racketeering laws designed to prosecute organized criminal enterprises. If we can prove coordinated fraud involving developers, consultants, and government officials, everybody goes to prison." The laptop keys clicked steadily as Tommy researched Pinnacle Property Management's corporate connections. "Holy shit, guys. Pinnacle has financial ties to the same environmental consulting firm that falsified the wetland surveys." "Full circle," Elena murmured. "They destroy the environment, build illegal structures, then profit from managing the communities they created through fraud." As afternoon sunlight slanted through my kitchen windows, we finalized our battle plan. Elena would conduct professional environmental assessments. Jake would coordinate with FBI public corruption units. Tommy would publish investigative articles building public pressure. Mabel would organize community support and provide historical documentation. And me, I would document everything with the systematic thoroughness that had made me a good Navy engineer. "One more thing," Jake said, packing his briefcase. "EPA fines automatically trigger flood insurance reassessments. Insurance companies don't cover damages from illegal construction. Meaning Delilah's homeowner's insurance becomes void the moment EPA confirms violations. She'll be personally liable for all environmental remediation costs." As my war council dispersed into the golden evening light, I stood on my memorial bridge watching the sun set over water that sparkled with deceptive beauty. Beneath that surface, chemical contamination was slowly poisoning the ecosystem Sarah had loved. Tomorrow, federal agents would begin the process of making it right. The sound of my phone buzzing with text messages from reporters felt like artillery support finally arriving. Game on, Delilah. Friday morning, Delilah discovered that federal investigations don't respect property values or designer sensibilities. I was drinking coffee on my dock at 6 a.m. when 2 black SUVs pulled into the community boat launch. EPA agent Sarah Crawford stepped out of the first vehicle, followed by a team of investigators carrying water testing equipment and cameras. The second SUV disgorged FBI agents in dark suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Agent Crawford was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 20 years prosecuting environmental criminals, tough as nails with eyes that could spot bullshit from orbit. "Mr. Blackwood?" She walked over with the confident stride of someone who'd shut down polluting factories and sent corporate executives to federal prison. "I'm Agent Crawford. We spoke on the phone." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for responding so quickly." "Mr. Blackwood, in my experience, when retired military engineers file environmental complaints with professional documentation, we pay attention." She gestured toward the lakefront mansions. "Your allegations are serious. If proven, we're looking at millions in federal penalties." That's when Delilah's white Tesla came screaming down the lakefront road like a bat out of hell. She parked at a crooked angle and practically leaped out, still wearing silk pajamas and a face mask that made her look like she'd been caught robbing a bank. Her perfectly styled hair was hidden under a designer sleep bonnet that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, marching toward Agent Crawford like she was addressing incompetent help. "This is private property. You can't just—" "Ma'am, I'm Agent Crawford with the Environmental Protection Agency." The agent's voice carried the weight of federal authority. "We're conducting an investigation into potential Clean Water Act violations. You need to step back." "This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer." Agent Crawford didn't even blink. "Ma'am, federal environmental law supersedes local property rights. You're welcome to call anyone you want, but this investigation will proceed. But here's where Delilah made her first critical error. Instead of staying calm and calling competent legal counsel, she started making threats in front of federal agents. Do you know who I am? My family has political connections that go back 3 generations. I'll have your badge. Agent Crawford's expression shifted from professional to predatory. Ma'am, are you threatening a federal agent conducting an official investigation? I'm stating facts. This community has standards, and we won't be bullied by some disgruntled newcomer with a grudge. FBI agent Marcus Johnson materialized beside Crawford like a well-dressed shadow. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. Threatening federal agents is a felony. That's when panic set in. Within an hour, every lakefront mansion owner was standing on their perfect lawns, watching federal agents collect water samples and document environmental violations. The sound of expensive smartphones dialing lawyers echoed across the lake like a chorus of financial terror. But Delilah wasn't done making mistakes. Around noon, she showed up at my property with Garrett Voss from Pinnacle Property Management and some guy in an expensive suit who screamed damage control specialist. Mr. Blackwood, the suit said with an oily smile that belonged in used car commercials. I'm Richard Steinberg, crisis management consultant. Mrs. Thornwick would like to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding. I was hosing duck droppings off my dock, a perfectly mundane task that somehow felt profound given the circumstances. No misunderstanding here. Federal agents are investigating environmental crimes. Come now, Steinberg continued. Surely we can reach some accommodation. Mrs. Thornwick is prepared to offer significant compensation for any inconvenience. Delilah couldn't keep her mouth shut. $50,000 cash and you withdraw your complaint. More money than your little shack is worth. The sound of my garden hose hitting the dock planks was the only noise for several heartbeats. Let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You're offering me money to withdraw a federal environmental complaint? It's a reasonable settlement, Steinberg started. That's called bribery, I interrupted. Attempting to influence a federal investigation through financial inducement. Felony offense. The color drained from Steinberg's face faster than water through a broken dam. But Delilah kept digging her own grave. You think you're so smart with your little research project? I've been making phone calls too. County Commissioner Wall shows me favors. This investigation can disappear just as quickly as it started. That's when I pulled out my phone and stopped the recording app I'd been running since they arrived. Gentleman, lady, I said politely. You've just confessed to attempted bribery and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. All recorded with timestamp and GPS coordinates. Steinberg was already walking toward his car. Garrett looked like he wanted to disappear into the lake, but Delilah stood there with her mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. You can't record private conversations. Ma'am, this is a single-party consent state. I can record any conversation I'm part of. I smiled for the first time in weeks. And federal agents love citizen cooperation in corruption cases. As they drove away in panicked haste, Agent Crawford's voice carried across the water from Delilah's property. Ma'am, you need to evacuate this structure immediately. We're declaring it an environmental hazard. The sound of Delilah's hysterical screaming mixed with the gentle lapping of lake water against my dock. Music to my ears. Saturday brought nuclear warfare disguised as neighborhood politics. I woke to the sound of diesel engines and angry voices. Outside my kitchen window, 3 news vans had set up camp in the community parking area, satellite dishes reaching toward heaven like technological prayers. Tommy Dakota's investigative series had gone viral overnight, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of the Willowbrook Lake environmental scandal. My phone had been buzzing since 5 a.m. with interview requests, but I was more interested in the black sedan parked across from Delilah's mansion. FBI surveillance, probably recording every desperate phone call she was making to lawyers, politicians, and anyone else who might save her from federal prosecution. That's when she played her final card. Around 10 a.m., Sheriff's Deputy Kevin Walsh knocked on my door with a restraining order that reeked of desperation and legal malpractice. Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry about this, Deputy Walsh said, clearly uncomfortable with the paperwork he was serving. Mrs. Thornwick filed a complaint alleging you've been harassing and threatening community members. I scanned the court document while Deputy Walsh shifted nervously from foot to foot. Says here I'm prohibited from approaching within 500 feet of Mrs. Thornwick or her property. Based on what evidence? Sir, I just served the papers. But between you and me, this seems like a civil matter that shouldn't involve law enforcement. The restraining order was a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Delilah's sworn statement, I was a potentially dangerous individual with military training who has made veiled threats against community safety. She claimed my environmental complaint was actually a harassment campaign designed to intimidate lawful property owners. But here's what happens when you file false statements with federal agents listening. Everything gets recorded and investigated. Agent Crawford materialized beside Deputy Walsh like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Deputy, I need to see that court order," she said with the authority of someone who'd dealt with obstruction of justice cases before. Deputy Walsh handed over the paperwork, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Agent Crawford studied the document for about 30 seconds before pulling out her phone. "Agent Johnson, we've got attempted witness intimidation through fraudulent court filings. Yes, active federal investigation. I need you here now." She hung up and looked at Deputy Walsh. "Deputy, Mrs. Thornwick just filed false statements alleging harassment in order to interfere with a federal environmental investigation. That's obstruction of justice." "Ma'am, I'm just serving papers." "You're serving fraudulent papers designed to silence a federal witness. This restraining order is now evidence in a criminal conspiracy case." That's when things got really interesting. FBI agent Johnson arrived with backup just as Delilah's crisis management team was setting up their own press conference on her front lawn. Richard Steinberg had brought professional lighting and a podium that screamed damage control emergency. But Delilah's mouth was about to betray her one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," she began, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's cars. "I'm here to address the malicious lies being spread by a disgruntled neighbor with obvious mental health issues." I watched from my dock as she dug her own grave deeper with every word. This environmental investigation is based on fabricated evidence from a man who clearly cannot accept community standards. His obsession with our neighborhood has escalated to harassment, property damage, and now false federal complaints designed to damage property values. Agent Crawford was taking notes and recording everything on official equipment. "Furthermore," Delilah continued, "this individual has used his military background to intimidate elderly residents and manipulate government agencies into harassing law-abiding citizens." That's when Agent Johnson stepped forward with handcuffs. "Mrs. Thornwick, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and making false statements to federal agents." The press conference dissolved into chaos. Cameras swung toward the FBI agents. Steinberg started shouting about constitutional rights. Delilah's perfect composure finally shattered completely. "You can't arrest me. I know people. My husband's law firm has connections to the Attorney General's office." "Ma'am, your husband's law firm just withdrew from representing you," Agent Johnson said, reading from his phone. "Apparently they don't want to be associated with federal corruption charges." As they led Delilah away in handcuffs, still screaming about political connections and community standards, I noticed something beautiful happening across the lake. The water near her mansion was starting to look different, clearer. Natural springs were beginning to flow again as EPA remediation crews removed decades of illegal fill material. Cattails were already sprouting in areas that had been manicured lawns just days before. Tommy Dakota appeared beside me with his camera, documenting the environmental restoration in real time. "Mr. Blackwood, any comment on Mrs. Thornwick's arrest?" I watched federal agents sealing off her glass mansion with crime scene tape while environmental crews continued restoring natural wetlands. "Sometimes nature finds a way to reclaim what was stolen," I said, thinking about Sarah and her love for migrating waterfowl. "And sometimes it gets help from retired engineers who don't like bullies." The sound of Delilah's Mercedes being towed away was sweeter than morning coffee. The lake was coming back to life, one restored spring at a time. The emergency town hall meeting was standing room only, with 400-plus people crammed into the high school auditorium that normally hosted basketball games and graduation ceremonies. Local TV cameras lined the walls like electronic vultures, their red recording lights creating a constellation of accountability across the packed room. I sat in the front row next to Jake Morrison, watching Delilah make her grand entrance through the back doors. She'd posted bail that morning and arrived with a new legal team that probably cost more per hour than most people made in a month. Designer black suit, crocodile tears already streaming down her surgically perfect cheeks, playing the role of misunderstood victim with Oscar-worthy commitment. Her crisis management consultant had obviously coached her well. Gone was the imperious HOA president who'd threatened federal agents. In her place stood a trembling woman in widow's weeds, clutching tissues like lifelines. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice quavering with manufactured emotion, "I stand before you tonight as someone who's been unfairly targeted by a vindictive neighbor with obvious mental health issues." The crowd murmured uncertainty. Delilah had always been polarizing, but seeing her in handcuffs on the evening news had generated some sympathy. This environmental investigation is based on technical paperwork issues that every homeowner faces. "My family has lived on this lake for 3 generations, and we've always been responsible stewards of our natural resources." She dabbed her eyes with designer tissues. "But Mr. Blackwood has weaponized government bureaucracy to pursue a personal vendetta that started with his refusal to follow reasonable community standards." Some people in the audience were actually nodding. Delilah was good at this. "His obsession with our neighborhood has escalated from property violations to harassment to false federal complaints designed to destroy the property values we've all worked so hard to build." That's when she made her fatal mistake. "I mean, look at the man's bridge." Her voice cracked with theatrical outrage. "It's an eyesore, a rustic memorial that completely disrupts our lakefront's natural beauty. Who builds folk art projects on valuable waterfront property?" The auditorium went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming and camera motors whirring as every eye in the room turned toward me. Folk art projects. She'd called Sarah's memorial a folk art project. I stood up slowly, feeling 400 pairs of eyes following my movement. Jake squeezed my shoulder as I walked to the microphone that had been set up for community comments. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Ezra Blackwood." I looked directly at the cameras, knowing this moment would define everything that followed. "Mrs. Thornwick just called my memorial bridge to my deceased wife a folk art project, an eyesore that disrupts natural beauty." I paused, letting that sink in. "Let me show you what natural beauty actually looks like." Jake handed me a remote control, and the auditorium's projection screen came alive with aerial photographs. This is Willowbrook Lake in 1985. Notice the wetlands, the natural springs, the seasonal floodplains that supported migrating waterfowl for thousands of years. Click, next photo. This is the same area in 2020. Notice what's missing? The wetlands have been filled with illegal sand and gravel. Natural springs have been buried under concrete foundations. Critical wildlife habitat has been replaced with infinity pools and wine cellars. The crowd was leaning forward now, studying the evidence with growing understanding. EPA water quality tests confirm that chemical contamination from those infinity pools has increased 340% since 2020. 7 families have been displaced from their homes due to contaminated well water traced directly to illegal construction. Click. Next photo showed Delilah's mansion with EPA hazmat tape across the entrance. Mrs. Thornwick's $2.8 million home is built on illegally filled wetlands in direct violation of federal environmental law. Her infinity pool sits on top of a natural spring system that once supported the entire lake ecosystem. FBI agent Sarah Crawford stood up in the back of the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm that Mrs. Thornwick is facing federal charges for environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud government agencies. The investigation has revealed systematic violations spanning 2 decades. County Health Director Marcus Williams took the microphone. "I can also confirm that EPA findings show 7 families have been displaced due to water contamination linked directly to illegal construction practices. This is now a public health emergency." The crowd was starting to understand the scope of what had been hidden behind HOA politics and property management companies. "Mrs. Thornwick called my bridge an eyesore," I said, walking closer to where she sat surrounded by lawyers. "But my bridge honors the memory of a woman who died loving this lake and its wildlife. It's built on legally owned property with proper permits and community easement rights." I gestured toward the screen showing her mansion wrapped in federal crime scene tape. Her mansion is built on stolen wetlands with fraudulent permits and falsified environmental assessments. It represents 2 decades of ecological destruction hidden behind lawyers and political connections. The standing ovation started in the back row and swept forward like wildfire. 4 minutes of thunderous applause that rattled the gymnasium windows and probably registered on seismic equipment. When it finally died down, I had one more thing to say. Sometimes nature finds a way to reclaim what was stolen. And sometimes it gets help from people who believe that environmental justice matters more than property values. Delilah was already fleeing through the back exit. designer heels clicking frantically across linoleum as federal agents followed to ensure she didn't violate her bail conditions. The sound of justice finally arriving was sweeter than spring rain on cedar. 6 months later, Willowbrook Lake looked like nature's own victory lap, and my heart had finally learned how to heal. Delilah Thornwick had pleaded guilty to federal environmental crimes and received 18 months probation, $75,000 in fines, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowner association board. Her glass mansion, the one that used to sparkle like liquid diamonds, now sat empty and partially flooded as EPA crews continued restoring natural spring flows. Property value down 60%. Bankruptcy papers filed 3 weeks after sentencing. But watching her downfall wasn't what gave me peace. It was standing on my memorial bridge at sunrise, watching a family of wood ducks paddle past with 6 fuzzy ducklings in tow, knowing Sarah would have cried happy tears at the sight. The emergency HOA election had been a landslide victory for common sense. I'd won the presidency with 89% of the vote, running on transparency and actual community service. Our first board meeting lasted 6 hours as we systematically deleted every petty power rule Delilah had imposed. Mabel Fitzgerald became our secretary, bringing 30 years of courthouse wisdom to covenant interpretation. The lake itself was recovering like something out of a nature documentary. EPA remediation had restored 12 acres of natural wetlands, and the spring system flowed clear and strong for the first time since the 1980s. Water quality improved so dramatically that the county lifted fishing restrictions months ahead of schedule. Native waterfowl populations exploded 400% within 6 months. Great blue herons stalked shallows where infinity pools used to dump chlorinated water. And the wood ducks, Sarah's absolute favorites, had returned in numbers not seen for decades. We'd established the Sarah Blackwood Environmental Scholarship that spring, $50,000 annually for students pursuing environmental engineering. The funding came from EPA settlement money, ensuring Delilah's crimes would train the next generation of wetland protectors. Our annual Lake Restoration Festival drew 2,000 visitors, raising another $30,000 for conservation, while local TV stations covered it as a model for community environmental action. The State University established a permanent research station here. School groups visit monthly to learn about ecosystem restoration and citizen environmental enforcement. 3 other lake communities have contacted us about replicating our methods. But the sweetest victory was personal. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had become more than our environmental consultant. We'd been sharing dinners and sunset walks, talking about Sarah and Elena's late husband Miguel, planning new conservation projects while discovering that healing doesn't dishonor the past. It honors it by building something beautiful for the future. Last Tuesday, she brought her granddaughter to feed the ducks from my bridge. 8-year-old Sophia scattered breadcrumbs while chattering about how Grandpa Ezra was teaching her to identify different waterfowl species. The sound of her laughter mixing with duck calls was pure joy. Sarah would have loved her, Elena said quietly, watching Sophia giggle at a particularly bold mallard. She would have spoiled her rotten, I replied, feeling gratitude instead of grief for the first time in months. My bridge had become the neighborhood's heart. Jake Morrison brings his grandkids here to fish. Tommy Dakota held his wedding reception on the island. Even former Delilah supporters admit the memorial is beautiful, especially when morning light catches the hand-carved duck motifs. Deputy Walsh stopped by last week with news that made everything worthwhile. Mr. Blackwood, we haven't had a single HOA harassment complaint since the new board took over. First time in 15 years. That's because we're actually serving people instead of serving power, I told him. As evening painted the lake in gold and crimson, I pulled out my phone for the weekly YouTube video that had grown into something bigger than I'd ever imagined. 500,000 subscribers, mostly folks fighting their own HOA nightmares. Welcome back to Karen Stories, everyone. Drop your craziest homeowner association horror story in the comments. The wildest one gets featured next week when we expose an HOA that tried to ban vegetable gardens as agricultural eyesores. I looked into the camera, thinking about Sarah's love for nature, Mabel's fierce determination, Elena's scientific expertise, and a community that chose environmental justice over property values. Don't forget to subscribe to Karen Stories for more episodes where regular people beat corrupt systems through research, determination, and sometimes federal environmental law. Because the little guy can win, especially when Mother Nature's fighting alongside him. The gentle sound of restored springs flowing into clean lake water provided the perfect soundtrack for victory. Sarah's ducks were finally home.